Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations.
We are witnessing a full court press in the church on matters of secular politics, my least favorite subject to cover on this channel because this is not a secular politics channel. But unfortunately, ever since the big bad orange man won his election, and ever since the American public seems to support him on his migration policies more than any other subject, so the data keeps coming back with ever since that became the reality, the powers that should not be in the church have decided they're going to try to win the hearts and minds of Catholics back to the side of progress, to the progressive cause. Many of our bishops are just politicians or branch managers of NGOs and have fully aligned themselves with the Democratic Party. That wouldn't necessarily be a problem if the Democratic Party reflected what the church has to say on things. After all, Catholics have historically voted for Democrats. And if Catholics who are historically voting for Democrats had the kind of influence on the Democratic Party that would suggest, it would mean that the Democratic Party would generally cater to Catholics, reflect our social positions on things. Of course, reality says something different. They take the advantage of the votes of Catholics because they tend to favor more government involvement in social issues when it comes to things like feeding the poor and the homeless and the things, or so their reputation says. Reality may actually be different on that. But it's enough for many Catholics to vote for them. Combine this with the fact that many of our bishops have redefined hot button terms like what it means to defend life in all of its forms and human dignity and all the rest of it. When you get all those things down, you see that there has been an operation going on in the political establishment to get Catholics to support one party over the other. For the last 3 or 4 presidential cycles, you will see that the polling data shows like more and more Catholics are kind of woken up to this, and you see that they are voting Republican. In fact, in the last presidential election, more Catholics voted for Trump than for Kamala Harris by a rather large number. And so now there is an operation going on to try to restore that. And it takes the form of probably the most critical of all of them, and that would be federal funding through USAID. The bishops are very upset about this. They're very upset that Catholic Charities, which got its money, much of it from the US government through the now ended USAID, and we'll talk about that in a moment, have lost their funding. And so they're going back for their funding. And they're doing it in this first bit here, by virtue signaling. Go to X, University of Notre Dame's, or Notre Dame, the United States, its official X account, where they post this, quote, Carrie Alice Robinson, the president and chief executive officer of Catholic Charities USA, will receive the 2025 Latate Medal, the oldest and most prestigious honor given to American Catholics, at commencement on May 18th. This should surprise exactly nobody. This is a political statement. I'm sure that the work she has done with Catholic Charities pleases the U.S. bishops and pleases the institutional leaders in the church in America to the degree where she, in their eyes, warrant a award of this stature. But the timing is not an accident. It is a political statement. James Martin, famously of the Jesuit Church, shared that post on his X account, saying it was richly deserved. And if you will be harder pressed to find an institutional voice more deeply connected to the U.S. bishops and reflecting their values than Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church. But this is all politics. All of this is. And the secular media has picked up on this. With this story, headline from Breitbart, D.C. Cardinal slams Trump's migration reforms as crusade. Calling that a crusade might be a bit much, but that's what they're doing. And as you'll see, Cardinal McElroy, and I've said this before here, he has been placed in the See of Washington, D.C., the most prestigious of all of them in the United States, not historically, but in contemporary time where politics has become the sort of de facto religion of the culture. It's become the most preeminent See because of its connection to the elites in Washington. Cardinal Ted McCarrick, famously used his position in Washington, D.C. to facilitate his nefarious activities. He can be seen rubbing shoulders with presidents of both parties. He could be seen hanging out with politicians of both parties, all in the name of representing the church in the United States to the elites in Washington. Fair enough, I suppose, except we know that he was deeply connected with some of the more nefarious assets, we'll say, in the US government who like to use him to, or did use him to help facilitate their programming that involves the church. The evidence for that is overwhelming, including the fact that he used to travel with envelopes full of cash around the world to meet with world leaders and other elites to help buy their loyalty, for whom we are not exactly sure. But we go here to this story, back to this story from Breitbart for this. Quote, the pathway of crusade and large scale removal cannot be followed in conscience by those who call themselves disciples of Jesus Christ. We must work to make sure that that does not happen, Cardinal Robert McElroy said in a speech to the Jesuit Refugee Service Organization in D.C. Most McElroy called for welcoming policies similar to those established by President Joe Biden's border czar Alejandro Mayorkas, saying, quote, the first pathway, which Catholic social teaching would support, is to change our laws so that they can have secure borders and dignity for the treatment of everyone at those borders and a generous asylum and refugee policy. I actually believe most Americans would be in favor of that pathway. McElroy's use of the crusade term suggests Trump policies are driven by zealotry, not by sympathy for Americans. Ironically, the term exists because McElroy's predecessors in the Catholic Church launched the Crusades in 1096 to liberate Christians from the redacted conquest of the Holy Land starting in the 800s. McElroy justified his anathematization of Trump's policies by citing the biblical story of the Good Samaritan, which describes how a man from the Samaritan ethnic group aided a wounded traveler of a different ethnic group after he'd been attacked. This story about one act of personal kindness on the roadside should be a guide for the U.S. government as it deals with the worldwide movement of people, according to McElroy. End quote. That is a co-opting of the use of the Good Samaritan story for political purposes. You'll notice McElroy it only barely pays lip service to what the church has to say about the actual issue at hand. The Catechism and theologians, going back to Aquinas, who've addressed this, have said the state has the right to dictate the terms on entering a country, on who can enter a country and who can be allowed to live there. That yes, there should be laws that help facilitate this when needed, but as a general rule, the government has the right to restrict it. And those who would enter a country have the responsibility, the moral responsibility, to follow the laws of the country they enter. This should not be controversial. For McElroy, it is. He goes out on a limb and says he thinks most Americans would support what he is suggesting. The data says other things. We know this if you've been paying even the vaguest kind of attention to the public approval of the new administration. Again, they get very high marks on removing people. The criticism they get from the public is they're not removing enough of them fast enough. McElroy is on the wrong side, at least of the political argument. But he's also on the wrong side of it morally because he's co-opting the use of this for his own purposes. And this has resulted in the place where the administration is its most popular, I think, after migration, and it's directly tied to it. So we go here to the secular world chiming in on another thing related to the church in the most weird way possible. And this comes to us from the New York Post with this headline. State Department formally shutters USAID after Trump court victory. Apologies for the pop-ups here. Our hosts have rules against using programs that prevent them from popping up. We will soldier on. The very basic general gist of this is USAID was established as part of the U.S. State Department. It was supposed to be under the umbrella of the Secretary of State. That's the chief diplomat of the United States. And its purpose was to help. USAID's purpose was to do essentially what most people kind of call charitable works, but in the interests of the United States. Since it was established, it became kind of independent, its own thing, barely getting any oversight from the government at all. The president brought it back into the State Department, and the State Department is now closing it down. To formally finish it, though, because while it was initially established by a president, it was then reconfirmed in its establishment by Congress. So it will take an act of Congress to finish the job, if they have the spine. Here are the details. Quote, The State Department formally announced Friday it is closing the U.S. Agency for International Development. The Trump administration prevailed in a federal court case challenging the Elon Musk led Department of Government Efficiency's cost cutting actions. Foreign assistance done right can advance our national interests, protect our borders, and strengthen our partnership with key allies. Unfortunately, USAID strayed from its original mission long ago. As a result, the gains were too few and the costs were too high, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a Catholic, said in a statement. Ex-Doge official Jeremy Lewin announced USAID's shuttering in an internal memo earlier Friday and said the State Department intends to assume responsibility for many of the agency's functions and programs, according to ABC News. Thanks to President Trump, this misguided and fiscally irresponsible era is now over. We are reorienting our foreign assistance programs to align directly with what is best for the United States and our citizens, Rubio added. We're continuing essential life saving programs and making strategic investments that strengthen our partners and our own country. This is yet another promise made and delivered to the American people. End quote. You get a lot of political speak there. I mean, what do you expect? You get politicians speaking. They're going to take every opportunity to remind you that they're doing the job they were elected for. Fair enough, I suppose. But these programs are popular, very popular. And nowhere in the teachings of the church, in the gospels, anywhere does it say that governments are expected to be the mechanism for charity. This is what most of these politicians don't figure out. And I say politicians here, meaning the bishops. Our Lord commands us to do charity. He commands us to do charity. Us, directly. That's the point of the Good Samaritan. You are supposed to help the person right in front of you. The church has this concept called subsidiarity. It's a concept in Catholic social teaching that means that decisions should be made by the lowest and most local authority possible in a political culture. The most local person is you helping your family and you helping your neighbors first. And then after that, it goes to your parish. Okay? That's what subsidiarity means. Then it goes on from there to up the ladder till eventually you get to international organizations. You and I are commanded to do charity ourselves. Another concept from Catholic social teaching called solidarity. Solidarity means love your neighbor. That's what it means. Nowhere in this equation does it mean government's supposed to take point. Nowhere in the equation does it say government can't be involved either. There is certainly a place for this stuff, or can be, if people want to have a discussion about it. But the central focus for the bishops here is on this belief that it is the responsibility of government to do it. And they take this point because, as it turned out, they got billions upon billions of dollars over the last 20 years to carry out these programs. And they're now hurting for it. So yes, the Cardinal seems to talk more about Donald Trump than most of Trump's own supporters do. That should be food for thought. Let me know what you think about this in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And if you've ever thought about supporting the work of Return to Tradition through YouTube here, does greatly help keep these messages coming. Viewers ask for options to do that themselves, and so there's some in the description box below, including Patreon, Subscribe Star, and all those kind of things, as well as, of course, that join button below. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.